Today we're going to define and give examples of rhetorical devices and figures of speech. So the following is going to be a list of stylistic devices that writers can use for various purposes. Such recognition can alert you to what a writer is trying to achieve. Let's start off with repetition. As the name suggests, using the same word, phrase, or structure repeatedly for emphatic effect, often, but not only just in poetry. For example, if you're repeating, you might say, "What kind of brainless garbage are you watching? It's trash." Now, repetition could use the same words or phrases, the exact same words, but a lot of times, in order to be more creative, you're going to use different words that mean the same thing. For example, garbage and trash. The next word we have is irony. Now, the main meaning of irony in writing is where the writer means the opposite of what he or she actually says, otherwise known as verbal irony. We also have dramatic irony, where you as the reader or the viewer would understand something that the character does not, or situational irony, something that is happening in your life. But most times when we look at writing, we're looking at verbal irony. For example, "How was school today?" And then perhaps in a sarcastic tone, somebody would say, "Great, fine." Now, situational irony might be defined as where a very bad situation overlaps with a more pleasant situation, but one which fails to compensate for the bad situation. For example, the doctor might tell you you're not dying. You're so pleased that you run out into the road and you get hit by a bicyclist. Now, dramatic irony is where the audience at a play or readers of a text know more than the characters do at that moment. Shakespeare, for example, likes to use dramatic irony frequently when he shares an aside with the audience, letting us into the inner thoughts of his character. For example, you might get a soliloquy from Iago in Othello, or maybe from Mark Antony in Julius Caesar, where the audience gets to hear their innermost thoughts and the others in the play do not. Alliteration is a good figure of speech to use for a rhetorical device. It's where a group of words all begin with the same sound, and you'd use that for emphasis, for emotional ends. "You muddling, malingering malefactors." An oxymoron is the juxtaposition of two apparently paradoxical words with the effect of drawing the reader's attention and making them realize, guess what, the opposite is true. For example, with Shakespeare again, when he has Romeo and Juliet state, "Parting is such sweet sorrow." Here the oxymoron is sweet and sorrow. You have two completely opposite words to give you the emphasized effect about how they're sad even though they were happy to be there. Now, when we think of the word rhetoric and the idea of a rhetorical device, we look at the idea of what rhetoric is and what a rhetorical question is. Now, a rhetorical question is a question which requires no answer of the viewer or the reader. For example, you might say, "Are you completely nuts?" There should be no defined answer that needs to be spoken. Rhetoric also has the purpose of allowing the writer to provide the answer. So, what are we to do about this? Let me, as the author, tell you. When we look at rhetorical devices of bathos, that is a deliberate anticlimax. And it's usually, but not always, for a humorous effect. Sometimes we might even consider it to be an understatement. "He returned from the war with medals, glory, and a strong desire for a cold beer." So we have this anticlimactic end at the sentence where we know he has earned these medals and glory because he's done great, fantastic, heroic ideas, and he also has a strong desire for a cold beer, something that could be easily obtainable. The antithesis in figures of speech would be placing of conflicting ideas alongside each other in order to sharpen their meaning. A fool trusts everyone. A wise person trusts herself alone. So we have these conflicting ideas where we want to talk about a fool and who they trust and a wise person and who they trust. Because here we're trying to gather some or inform somebody in order to gather wisdom. The word cliché means it's an overused expression, and you should avoid them in writing. At the end of the day, it was a game of two halves. Although sophisticated writers do have some success playing with cliches. I'm not saying that cliches cannot be used in rhetoric, but you should stay away from them unless you have some sort of success in being able to use them in a new and original manner. For example, films such as The Naked Gun mock cliches of police movie thrillers, for example. We also have the horror movies in which we take a look at them in a comedic kind of light. Emotive language. Now, emotive language is language designed to stir the emotions rather than the brain. Now, politicians and speechwriters are experts at using emotive language in rhetoric. For example, John F. Kennedy, in his inauguration speech, wrote, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Now, the opposite of that, language which is matter of fact, it's emotional, and it's downright ironic, would be known as referential language. The player has committed an error, and the fans are somewhat annoyed. Now, referential gives that idea to the reader or the viewer that they know those fans are very much annoyed. They're not somewhat annoyed, they're downright upset at the player committing an error. Next, we have a euphemism. A euphemism is a nice way of putting something uncomfortable or unpalatable. Instead of saying very directly, "You're fired," you might say, "The company is downsizing." Another rhetorical device would be an idiom. Now, an idiom is an expression which is not to be taken literally. Sometimes then it can be confusing to your reader or viewer, especially if English is not their first language. Often idioms can also be used as cliches, and they're almost always a metaphor. For example, your idiom, "It was raining cats and dogs," is written as a metaphor. Now, it's an idiom because if it actually was literally raining cats and dogs, lives would be at stake. You don't want to be hit by a cat or a dog as it falls from the sky, and certainly the cats and dogs would have problems for their lives as well. So when we say "it was raining cats and dogs," you actually mean the rain is pouring down very hard. You're going to get extremely wet. Another rhetorical device is using invectives. Be careful when you use invectives because they're very emotive, emotional language. And usually it's used with the purpose of expressing utter fury and anger about some issue. And here you can insert your own censored or bleeped material. Now, we've already spoken a little bit about metaphors in an idiom. So if we look at the figure of speech metaphor, it is an implicit comparison between two things. If we go back to William Shakespeare once again, he once wrote in his poetry, "All the world's a stage, and all its men merely players." So we have the men of the world being compared to being actors or players. We have the world at large itself being compared just being on stage. Next figure of speech we have is metonymy. And metonymy is the use of an attribute or quality towards someone instead of just stating the fact outright. When you say, "I really like Shakespeare," no, you don't. He's dead. You don't know the man. Do you mean you like Shakespeare's plays? The next figure of speech we'll be looking at is onomatopoeia. An onomatopoeia is where the sound of a word or a group of words literally mimics the meaning. So the word that you hear is what the meaning is. The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, and the furrow followed free. So if the breeze is blowing at us, you almost get that sense of that feeling of blowing that is going on. A paradox is a turn of phrase which suggests two irreconcilable ideas, which on closer inspection actually prove to go together. For example, a kind of extended oxymoron might be, she was concentrating very hard on being relaxed. Now, usually if you're relaxing, you don't want to concentrate on anything. And yet here it sounds like she is actively trying to relax. She's putting her full effort into relaxation. Another figure of speech would be personification. Personification is giving the inanimate human qualities, such as calling ships a she. Now, in narrative, it's often used to create an expressionist effect, where the reader sees everything through the eyes of a character and not necessarily the narrator. For example, if you stated, "The windows of the house stared menacingly towards their party." Well, the windows of the house are being compared as if they are eyes and they can stare. We've personified the house by making the windows the eyes. Windows don't have eyes. You've made it personified. Next rhetorical device we have is a litote. Now, litote is a deliberate understatement, and you're often using it for an ironic effect, and it usually involves a double positive or a double negative. For example, if you said, "Where did we go right?" You're probably stating that for ironic effect. You've probably had a lot of things going wrong. You probably expected things to go wrong. So you've now turned that understatement over on its head. You've done a complete 180 and you said, well, we kind of know we were expecting things to go wrong. Where did we go right? Tone is usually one of the most difficult things for people to understand when they're reading. Tone is the way in which a text conveys the mood of the writer. Now, two main divisions are formal and informal tone, but when we think of tone, we kind of think of an emotion. Perhaps the tone is friendly, perhaps it's hostile, perhaps it's humorous. It all depends upon the language being used by the author. The next rhetorical device is a synodose, and that is using a part for the whole. A lot of times students like to think a little bit in the way of a stereotype here. For a synodose, you might say, we need more hands in the kitchen. Well, here we need more people to work in the kitchen by using their hands. So instead of saying we need more people in the kitchen, we're going to state we need your hands to come into the kitchen. Now, of course, we need all of you to come into the kitchen, but we need more hands in the kitchen. We need more people to work in the kitchen. The next word we have is Zigma. Now, Zigma is when one verb governs two objects of different types, and usually this is used for a humorous, understated effect. For example, you might say, as an artist, he drew many fine pictures and a fine check from his agent each week. So if you're a successful and prolific artist, you're making many fine pictures, and you're also getting a lot of money for these pictures. So when it says he drew many fine pictures and he drew a fine check from his agent, he's obviously quite successful. And that is where we end our rhetorical devices and figures of speech. Thank you so much for stopping by. If you'd like to learn more about the elements of literature or figures of speech, please check out my other playlists. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed to my channel.